And welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Bud Elliott. That's Tom Fornelli. That's Danny Cannell. I'm Chip Patterson. Spring gleaning makes its way to the Big 12. We got a lot of work to do, gentlemen, because we got to get through the whole conference before football happy hour starts. And Danny Cannell's got to go and entertain the masses. Catch him on CBS Sports HQ, cbssportshq.com, or through the CBS Sports app, which I hope everyone is using to be able to keep up with all the March Madness. I don't even think that, few headlines over the weekend. Howard Schnellenberger, rest in peace, passed away. You also had the retirement for Barry Alvarez. Do you think that he stepped away from coaching and he came back? Will he be an interim AD somewhere, Barry Alvarez?
Yes,
I'm saying can't trust him. Can't trust him.
As soon as the next Wisconsin AD is fired or takes another job, Barry will step in to fill in his shoes for the time being.
Yeah, and he'll do a great job. He'll lead the athletic department through a bowl game. But other than that, we do have 10 teams to get through. So let's begin in the order of finish from last season so that we can stay honest here and not pick favorites. Iowa State Cyclones, 8-1 in Big 12 play, 9-3 overall. And we begin with the team where I don't have many questions. I mean, they bring back so much. They've got one of the two best quarterbacks in the Big 12. The defense is going to be bringing back a ton of starters. The only two positions I had circled were wide receiver and defensive line, both places where it sounds like even Matt Campbell and his staff just sort of have a handful of guys, and we'll see who emerges at those two positions, but I don't have a lot of concerns. I think Iowa State should be good. And the questions that stand out to me are ones that we really ask in August, where it's like, all right, expectations. Are you going to go do it? Are you going to make a playoff run? It feels very big picture right now because so many of our, day-to-day position by position questions, they seem to already be answered even before spring practice starts.
Okay. But what are your expectations for Iowa State?
That they compete for a Big 12 championship and a college football playoff spot.
But not a playoff. Oh, wait. So you think they could compete for a playoff spot?
They can't. I mean, I think that's what their Yeah, I think that should be their expectation. I'm not picking it, but I think that you got to go into the year, given everything that's in place in the season you had, got to say, all right, let's go. Let's make a run at it.
And Danny, you think they can get there too?
Well, I think, no, I would not pick them to do it. I think they'll be a trendy pick from a lot of people. A lot of returners, Brock Purdy coming back, Breece Hall coming back. I think a lot of people will be on Iowa State. And it's kind of like, I don't want this to sound offensive to Iowa State fans, but we talk about certain teams. We talk about returning starters, right? And if you're a bad team, is that a good thing? Well, with Iowa State, are their returning starters good enough for whoever's Oklahoma's going to replace people with, and Texas and the other teams that are up there? Now, I will say this. They've cut the gap where they're in that upper tier of talent in the Big 12. It's kind of like Alabama in the SEC. Like, you got to have something special to pick a different team other than Alabama to win the SEC. Same thing with Clemson in the ACC, and same thing with Ohio State. And I don't know if the talent is special enough to make me go out on a limb and say, man, this team is going to win the Big 12 and knock off Oklahoma and get to a playoff spot. Because, if they win the Big 12 with one loss, they're in the conversation.
So, I think we're all on the same page here, because going into the spring, I don't have too many questions about this team because I think it was a good team last year. I think it's been a good team the last few years, but I also like what you're saying, Danny, like everybody in the world is going to be on Iowa State this year. They're going to be an underdog, which is kind of causing me to back off because it's like, I get it. I understand why people are high on it. They've got a ton of people coming back. They've got a good quarterback. They've got a really good coach. They've got a good coaching staff, and they've shown an ability to really develop the program, develop the players, and to a certain extent overachieve based on the talent that they have. It's just, there's still a part of me that looks at last year with how crazy things were and the conditions that everybody was playing in. Like, that's the first time Iowa State has ever finished a season in the top 10 of the AP poll. Like, they finished at number 9 in the final rankings. I think it's only the third or fourth time they've ever finished a season, period, ranked.
That's true.
And it's like I have a difficult time looking at the history and results of this program in the long haul, thinking, okay, that's just the norm now. They're going to be a top 10 team. They're going to compete for a Big 12 title, all that stuff. I think that they can. It's just, I don't have, like I said, going into this spring, I'm not looking at this like, I need to see this. I need to see this. I think I know what I'm going to get with Iowa State. It's just, I think I'm probably going to get 8-4. And I think it's going to be a good 8-4, and there's going to be some wins that they should win, but they're going to lose some close games, that they have a chance to win. I think that's just the way things are going to work out, because when I still compare this team to the rest of the Big 12, and we're going to go through the rest of the conference as it stands, obviously, it's just not as talented a team as it has to compete with to win the conference. So I think it's going to be a very solid team. I don't see another top 10 season coming.
I could see it. I agree with the points you guys made. I think the downside risk with Iowa State is greater than the upside risk, right? I think they were very close to maximizing, the win total based on the talent that they have. And yet they bring back, an absolute ton of experience, right? You have a lot of guys who have played a lot of high quality football here. It is worth noting that the team we'll probably talk about next or the one after. Look, you kind of had to get Oklahoma last year. We all said this as part of our preseason narrative. And Iowa State, they got him once. They didn't get him twice. And they obviously lost in the championship game. But if I think, like, what are the next steps this team can take? First thing they have to do, I think, is replace Bailey, right? As a pass rusher, I mean, pressure rate of 10%, 7 sacks on the year. I mean, he was one of their best pass rushers, 29 pressures and, like forcing 14 incompletes, interceptions. That's a fairly big deal, based on his pressure. So they got to figure out a way to replace Bailey. I will say that Lawrence White basically never left the field. He had 377 coverage snaps for those guys. So that, not that he was an amazing player, but that's not a zero loss. But my main concern for this team, really, guys, is the receiver position. They did not do a good job of getting the ball down the field last year. They were 90 something, I think, in passing explosiveness. Just not a team that really had guys who scared you on the outside. I mean, Xavier Hutchinson was their best receiver by far, and yet, I mean, not great, just a solid player. They need to have somebody step up at receiver, I think, because I very much doubt that Oklahoma is going to be that down in terms of firepower 2 years in a row.
Yeah, because if you look at the efficiency aspect of it, like on defense, if you want to go by points per drive, Iowa State and Oklahoma were nearly identical. Like Iowa State allowed 1.55 points per drive and Oklahoma allowed 1.59. But if you go to the offensive side of the ball, there was a huge gap between Oklahoma and Iowa State. Oklahoma finished first in the Big 12, averaging 3.19 points per drive. Iowa State was third. They were behind Texas at only 2.71. And I think that the results last year weren't, not to take anything away, because they had the best regular season record. They did beat Oklahoma once. So obviously Oklahoma won the title game against them, but I just don't think the results were fairly accurate. And as I mentioned at times during last year, I thought it was just karma coming back for an Iowa State team that had played better at its record in the previous years, was getting some of the better luck that it didn't get in the last few years. And it kind of just evened out last year.
But when it showed up in the Big 12 championship game, it was every bit the part. I mean, you're right. They lost. Oklahoma got them, but that game was 27-21 and Oklahoma didn't get in the end zone after halftime. I kind of think that I'm looking at it more as this is the window, right? Like, you were right there in the Big 12 title game and couldn't get it done. You got another year, kind of the same group bringing it back. I kind of feel like they should go in with confidence that they can beat Oklahoma again. Beating Oklahoma twice, we all know that we're not going to bet on that, but I don't think that it was like they got outclassed in the Big 12 title game. Maybe TCU a couple years ago was one example of that, where maybe TCU won the regular season, but then when Oklahoma played them in the championship game, just dusted them. I kind of think that Iowa State defensively, they were facing one of the better versions of Oklahoma, and they still did a good job against it. So it's I think that it's fair to put them on that championship level tier with them for this year. Not big picture, since you've only finished in the AP top 25 at the end of the season 3 or 4 times.
What are the odds we look back and we say, 2020 was the window for Iowa State?
If Breece Hall goes down with an injury.
or if they just continue to not like to score in the low 20s in their biggest games. I mean, 21 against Oklahoma, 23 against Texas, 21 in the loss to Oklahoma State. Like that offense, it's a good offense. It's not an explosive offense yet. When they need to reach back and pump 98 in the ninth inning, they don't have it.
No, it's not how they're built.
Do you guys remember preseason last year? Brock Purdy was supposed to be like potential first rounder. Like there was a lot of love coming Brock Purdy's way that he was going to be one of the top tier quarterbacks in the country. And of course, when you set the bar that high and the expectation that high, when you play much less than that, less than the expectations, it makes it look a lot worse. But they got to get more out of Brock Purdy too. I mean, they relied on Breece Hall, which was fantastic. I mean, he was probably the surprise of the season out of the Big 12 with Hubbard being the guy that was supposed to be taking all the reps. But I still think Brock Purdy's got to give us more if they want to, take down Oklahoma.
He looked like an NFC East quarterback winning ugly games in the mid-20s, figuring out ways to get it done. The Oklahoma Sooners, 6-2 in Big 12 play, 9-2 overall. A lot to be excited about. Spencer Rattler, after a little bit of a shaky start to the season, came on strong. This whole Oklahoma team, they got some important pieces back in the lineup. And, now we're starting to look at next season with another year with Rattler, young wide receivers, real talented. This is going to be one of the best offenses, not just in the Big 12, but in the entire country. Kennedy Brooks is back after opting out. Ramondre Stevenson is gone, but Eric Gray is in from Tennessee. Also wanted to note Seth McGowan, who played all right in a couple spots as Oklahoma was really pressed at that running back position. Speaking of Tennessee, we've got some position battles along the offensive line. Bedenbaugh always gets a lot of credit for leading some of the best offensive lines around. That group, like the rest of the offense, kind of took the whole season to get their footing. But hey, again, pandemic season, I'm willing to, say there's some reason for that. Wanye Morris is going to be in there joining that group. They got to replace Creed Humphrey at center. I think that's big. And defensively, while I don't think they have anything settled on the back end, does Oklahoma have one of the better defensive fronts in the conference? Because I think there might be an argument. And if so, you're looking at a team that's going to have one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks, the best passing offense, and potentially one of the best defensive fronts. Shocker, Oklahoma goes into the season likely as the favorite to win the Big 12.
Yeah, we're looking at our Big 12 champ.
Yeah. Okay, cool. What it feels like.
Next.
I mean, yeah, I just think that like going into the spring, the questions I have, like you're right, Chip, that offensive line last year was good, but it wasn't as good as the Oklahoma offensive lines we'd seen the previous years, but it wasn't bad. I think receiver is the most interesting aspect to this team this spring, just to see who, if anybody's going to step forward, because obviously Oklahoma always has receivers, but there's no proven guy right now. So there's going to be some open spots. There's going to be competition. And as we've seen, I don't think they need elite receivers to win the Big 12, but if they want to get to the playoff and win a game this time, they're going to need somebody to step up and become that guy to make big plays. Because I do think Spencer Rattler is going to improve this year. He's improved as last season went on, and I think he's probably the best QB in the Big 12. He's one of the best QBs in the country. So I just look at this team's talent. I look at the way the defense improved last year. I don't think it's going to be an elite defense in 2021, but I think it could be good enough. And I think that front seven is pretty good, and it better be one of the best in the conference, considering how they out-recruit everybody in the conference besides Texas. But it's the clear-cut best team. Is in a vacuum where nothing goes wrong and everybody's at full strength. I just think there's a huge gap between Oklahoma and everybody else in this conference in 2021.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, well, like specifically, I think Marvin Mims at wide receiver is like, you got to go to him and you got to say he's there. I know that Bud, you've been a big Jaden Hazelwood champion of his. There are a lot of players that were freshmen and sophomores last year who played a big role in the passing game. And I think that when you think about everybody from that group coming back, and I think that even they've continued to recruit the wide receiver position well, it's isn't that the reason Charleston Rambo probably left? He looked around and he saw young dudes that were going to take his role, and he said, later.
That's my thought. Like I had Rambo leaving. Like, can we read something into this? Because if you look at this, who's a better passer, right? D'Eriq King or Spencer Rattler? Like, whose offense is better for catching balls? All right. So you're leaving a place that is, you're going to catch a lot more balls and probably, be more productive to go to Miami. And maybe it's just big fish, small pond as far as Miami's receiving room, like we talked about a couple episodes ago. I think that there's a lot of talent here, guys, like a whole lot, right? So Theo Weiss can play. Marvin Mims has a lot of upside. Drake Stoops played decently for them, actually. But then, like we talked about, Trajan Bridges is a stud if he can, stay focused, stay healthy, stay on the field. Hazelwood was the guy who was legitimately in the conversation for the number one receiver in his recruiting class, and he has just not been able to stay healthy there. I haven't seen him, a whole lot recently, but assuming he hasn't lost a step from the injury stuff, he should still be really, really good. I'm fairly I'm buying this receiving core, for this year. I'm a little bit worried about replacing Creed Humphrey and Adrian Ely. Ely was a very nice tackle for them. Humphrey was one of the best centers in the country. But I think this offense overall, because of the greater experience that it has, will be more buttoned up this year and will have fewer sort of unforced errors. They were actually very uncharacteristically 110th in havoc rate allowed last year. And that's just not something that Oklahoma typically does. I think that it was very much youth related, whether receivers running the wrong routes or Rattler being young or the offensive line kind of being in flux there. But they got it together at the end of the year. And the stuff that Kansas State was doing to them, other teams didn't do to them nearly as well, down the stretch last year. Defensively, I'm kind of bullish as well, right? Losing Ronnie Perkins sucks. Perkins is a real difference maker, but Nick Benito, South Florida kid, pretty good pass rusher for them last year. They have Stripling still. They get Caleb Kelly back at linebacker, somebody who was out for the whole year last year. And then something I noticed on defense, like their explosive play rate was very high, and it was basically the only thing that wasn't good or very good about that defense. And I think the one spot where they're really not losing very much off last year's team is in that back seven. So if those guys can communicate better, have fewer busts, I mean that could really be a nice help here for the Sooners, who are my conference favorite for sure.
So what kind of odds can I get on Oklahoma or the field? And does anybody want to take the field?
Ooh. If you give me 3-1, I'll take the field.
All right, yeah.
On that one, I'm always.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Put it on the tab.
A field guy. Although I do think Oklahoma, I think this year Oklahoma wins their first playoff game. So I'm bullish on Oklahoma. I just always take the field because what happens if some, injuries happen, stuff goes down. I thought the defense, Alex Grinch, I think this defense is getting better and better. Spencer Rattler, if you look last year, he had 7 picks on the year. 5 of them came in the first 4 games. Remember halftime he got benched against Texas and it flipped the switch. It's yeah, can't throw it to the other team anymore. And he definitely dialed in, was more careful with the football. You guys mentioned some of the losses out. The offensive line, Rattler's mobile enough where it shouldn't be a big problem while they're working in some of these new spots along the offensive line. So I think this is the year that Oklahoma gets in position to win their first playoff game, play for a national championship. I don't know if I'm willing to go far and say, hey, this team's going to win it all, but I think this will be their best team that they've had yet.
That'll be fun. Hey, Cover 3 listeners, it's still madness time in the sports world with the NCAA tournament as crazy as ever. See how many points they scored in overtime? Preposterous. But if you're a diehard sports fan, it means you want to stay in the know with all sports. And that's where CBS Sports HQ is your streaming answer. Just think about what's on tap this week alone. We've got NFL draft and offseason coverage, MLB opening day on Thursday, Bellator 255 on Friday, golf picks and highlights, and of course, unmatched breaking news coverage. I was on earlier today, and sure enough, Matt Norlander was just breaking news about Oklahoma State coach Mike Boynton getting an extension in the middle of an HQ hit. It absolutely never stops. It's available on your computer, on your phone via the CBS Sports app, and on your connected TV. I leave it on all day, and if you live and breathe sports, I'd encourage you to do so as well. The Oklahoma State Cowboys. Dare I say, upon review, maybe the record was better than the team kind of felt. But maybe that's because of expectations, just because I go into the year thinking, boom, Spencer Sanders, Chuba Hubbard, Tylan Wallace. This is the best quarterback, running back, wide receiver trio in college football, and had all these expectations. And I mean, the offense was okay. Oklahoma State was really like led by its defense. Like the reason why Oklahoma State won and was successful had nothing to do with that headlining trio. Hubbard's gone. Wallace is gone. Also, Dylan Stoner's gone. Spencer Sanders was loose with the ball. He saw his touchdown to interception ratio flip dramatically from that freshman season. I think at the wide receiver position, I take note of, remember Wallace played a half, but then opted out of the bowl game at halftime. It was pre-planned. But Brennan Presley had a really good game in that, a really good performance in that bowl game. So I'll be curious to see if he ends up being the new wide receiver one there. They bring back a lot of players on defense. Can the defense be strong again? And is it fair to have the expectation that Oklahoma State's offense might just be okay? And what does that say about Spencer Sanders and/or Mike Gundy as we go into this spring looking for answers?
I was gonna say the defense better still be pretty good, because
I don't see any answers to say things are going to be awesome on offense.
Yeah, because I think a lot of that's going to depend on if Spencer Sanders improves at all, because it's strange, because if you look at his stats from a freshman to sophomore, now obviously they played 2 fewer games last season, but as a freshman he completed 155 passes on 247 attempts. As a sophomore, he completed 155 passes on 247 attempts. You don't see that a lot where a guy has the same attempts and completions from year to year, but his yards per attempt went down by 0.3 yards per attempt. His adjusted yards stayed about the same. So it's like he pretty much had the same season as a sophomore that he had as a freshman. It's just when you have that season as a freshman, you're like, hey, this is a kid, showed a lot as a freshman. He's got potential to grow. But then when you do it as a sophomore, it's like, wheels are still kind of spinning in the mud. You don't know if he's going to improve or if he's just a finished product who you've tapped into and you've gotten everything you got. And as you mentioned, with the players that they're losing on offense, it's like, okay, he's losing a lot of the talent around him, and now you really need him to take that step forward. So if he does, I think Oklahoma State is a team that could be, a pleasant surprise in the Big 12 this year. If he doesn't, I think it could be kind of a downer kind of season for the Cowboys, which is another one of the reasons why, again, I'm taking Oklahoma over the field.
So, like, their run game sucked last year.
Yes.
I mean, they were 111th in rushing success rate, right, and 80th in rushing efficiency. And yet I looked at it, and I was like, man, their passing game was fine on an efficiency basis. And I was thinking about it, and I really think this is where, like, going to the numbers more helps you, and having watched the games can really help, because I really think defenses were just ganging up against the run against these guys last year and daring them to beat them through the air, trying to keep Spencer Sanders in the pocket, right? I mean, and looking at this, teams basically zoned them and didn't think Spencer Sanders could complete balls against zone. They faced zone more than 75% of the time, which is, pretty well above the national average. I think the teams were just trying to take away the run game, and okay, if Sanders beats us with his arm, fine. And some of his numbers were okay, but oftentimes he was not able to beat them, with his arm, particularly when they got into obvious passing situations. That wasn't happening. So yeah, I do share y'all's concerns about, about the offense. I will say the one thing that makes me a little bit more bullish on it is, yeah, they lose Jackson, right? Who, is an awesome offensive tackle, but like the rest of the offensive line last year was a total mess with injuries. I mean, they had guys go down nonstop. I remember looking at the preseason, like, who do they have left? Like are they going to be playing walk-ons here? And, Tulsa ate them up early in the year, like basically because the offensive line couldn't block. And I think that you could avoid a big drop-off in offense if the offensive line is just somewhat better and a little bit more consistent. Because, good offensive line, or at least an okay one, with a guy who can move around like Spencer Sanders, they could make something happen. And I don't want to just discount Gundy's ability to put up points. But yeah, they do lose an awful lot. I think their secondary would be much better too on the other side of the ball. I'm not quite as down on this team as it sounds like Tom is.
I'm not down on them either. But again, I'm kind of like Tom. Like, well, I'm not picking them to win the Big 12. Right. But hello, that's not, but like, I wouldn't be surprised if they're the second or third best. Like, I think that's a pretty good ceiling for them to reach, like to challenge Oklahoma for the Big 12. Their defense, 7 guys returning. The offensive line, which you mentioned, 6 of them have, because of some of those injuries, they get to cycle in. They actually get some playing experience. They got 6 starters on the offensive line, or 6 players with starting experience coming back. So that's a good thing. And this team was a completely different look because the run game was shut down so massively. And it was also, you had 26 sacks given up, and Spencer Sanders missed a couple games because he was hurt. Like, it was a lot to overcome. In fact, when we're doing this, I was kind of surprised. I forgot that they finished this high in the Big 12, because I feel like we wrote them off last year. You know, like I was like, oh, I pictured them around 500. You're like, oh, wait a second. They had a nice bowl performance. Like, they actually won that game. Like, this team didn't go anywhere. It just wasn't the team we thought it was going to be. So I think their defense will be back. I think they'll be good. I think they'll be pretty solid. And I agree with all of you guys. I think it's going to determine, like, Spencer Sanders, can he take that next step? Like, does he have another gear to get to? And maybe with a run game, maybe you get that out of him.
Oh, Danny, 2 things. Number one, I also think just sometimes we see young quarterbacks improve on their ability to throw to the middle of the field as they get older. And for Spencer Sanders, that was something that he just did not do really at all, right? So 51% of his passes went to outside receivers. That's basically the tops in the country. So, like, he was constantly putting the ball outside. If he does keep
Check
with that
Thailand.
yeah, right? And, like, backs, nope. Tight ends, nope. Slots, not really. Just chucking it outside. I will say Tay Martin could be a dude who could be a breakout guy for them at receiver. And I know they got a lot to replace at receiver, but I think Tay Martin has an ability to step up and do some stuff for them. He actually kind of flashed a little bit last year as a reserve.
The Texas Longhorns, 5-3, 7-3 after an awesome bowl performance. Casey Thompson, Bijan Robinson, and see you later, Tom Herman. Thanks for the bowl win, but you can pack your things now, and your new coordinators too, because Steve Sarkisian is loading up a caravan. They're leaving Tuscaloosa, and they're coming down to Austin. Sark arrives with a star-studded coaching staff, many from the Crimson Tide. Also, he went out to go get Pete Kwiatkowski in as the defensive coordinator. And so, you know, we put in some of the same expectations and questions that we do for a lot of these first-year coaches, especially ones who inherit rosters as talented as Texas is. What's it going to look like? What do we know? Like, what can we get from spring practice, from your spring notes and tidbits and everything we're getting from the boots on the ground? What can we do to create an expectation? Because we don't have much from last year. Quarterback battle is going to be the headliner here. Casey Thompson and Hudson Card. Thompson, as we just mentioned, with the awesome performance in the bowl game. Hudson Card, let's run back an old sound clip, because just like how CJ Stroud was number 3 quarterback in the class behind Bryce Young and DJ Uiagalelei. That's right. Am I correct? Hudson Card was the number 4, 1 spot behind CJ Stroud.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, hey, yeah. If I don't know how far I can stretch that down in the quarterback rankings from that class to make you sound awesome because of your proximity to DJ Uiagalelei, but it extends to Hudson Card. Brennan Eagles and Tariq Black, the Michigan transfer, are both gone. Joshua Moore, the leading returning receiver. I think Bijan Robinson is one of the most exciting all-purpose stars in all of college football. So, I mean, those are the pieces that you've got there. What do you look like on defense? A lot of Sark Year 1 questions. Texas is one of the most interesting places in the country right now for college football. So I don't know, where y'all's heads at? What's on the top of mind for spring practice?
Ellinger actually was a good QB last year.
Yeah.
Like good throwing the ball honestly, I used to kind of dog him a little bit. I thought he was more of just a, Tim Tebow light, like a runner, but not really a great thrower. And last year he actually threw the ball well. So, like, who wins this quarterback battle is actually going to have pretty big throwing shoes to fill, whether it's Card or Thompson. And I think Texas quarterback room is really nice here. I think Thompson and Card can both play. And so I don't think anybody's going to win the job absent injury, just by default. So I feel like that's something to look out for there. Like, they should have decent quarterback play. Sark pretty much always does. So I'm fairly confident they'll have, good QB play. I will say last year, their receivers let them down over and over again, man. I mean, and now, so Brennan Eagles is gone. Jake Smith is already out for spring with, I believe I read on Horns 24/7 with a foot fracture. I'm a little bit concerned about the receiver position here, especially with a new quarterback you're breaking in. And then defensively, is Juwan Mitchell gone again? Like, I don't know how many times he's going to jump into the transfer portal, but it seems like he's not around for spring practice right now. He was their leading tackler last year. And then I think replacing Joseph Asai is not necessarily super easy. I mean, he was kind of like just plug him in and pass rush last year. So those are kind of what I'm watching for with Texas. There's pieces here I like. Certainly, Bijan is nasty. But there's some real questions here.
Yeah, this is a really interesting spot and what I'm kind of excited for in 2021, because I think there's a pretty decent range of outcomes, because I don't think Tom Herman, if you look at his results in Austin, it's like they weren't as good as Texas fans wanted, but they were trending in the right direction. Like, it's the first time I felt like there was a coach at Texas that had a positive trajectory going, even though not in comparison to the expectations, in a long time. And I think that Sark is inheriting a pretty good roster, even if a lot of the production from last year's gone. So I look at the situation, I'm like, this team could be pretty darn good in 2021. And I think Sark's a very good offensive mind. We saw what he was able to do at Alabama to help that offense and make it one of the most elite offenses in the country. So I look at the quarterback talent he has. I look at Bijan Robinson, and I think of Bijan Robinson being used more in like the same kind of ways we saw Najee Harris used with Alabama, and I think that could be really good for that Texas offense. I think that offensive line was good. It loses a couple key guys, but I still think that they've recruited and developed enough there where I'm not worried about that being a problem. I think there's plenty of talent on the defensive end. So I think that, honestly, as I break down the teams, just looking at them from what we know right now, I feel like Texas is the number 2 team in the conference. It doesn't mean I think it's going to win the conference. I think it could be a 9-3 team and still be the second best team in the Big 12 this year. So I just see a lot of talent. I see a good coach in Sark, and I see a team that was in a good spot last year. And I don't think Tom Herman was fired because of his coaching. I think he was fired because of the eyes of Texas and all that crap off the field. So I'm kind of excited about Texas. That doesn't, again, they could completely crash and go 7-5, 6-6, but I see a pretty high ceiling for them heading into the spring.
I do too. I'm more bullish on Texas, but then like when you dive deeper into it, you look at how, because I was under the impression that he's inheriting a full cupboard, right? Like a pretty good situation of young talent, which probably is the case. But then you look at the defense, which was 8th in the Big 12 with 17 sacks, 5 of which came from Joseph Asai, who's gone. Graham had 2. He's gone as well. You're like, all right, where is the pass rush going to come from? Where is a physical team up front going to come from? But maybe you don't need it in the Big 12 as much against some of these teams. Bud said something about Sam Ehlinger where I think it's going to go one of 2 ways. One is, I think there's a faction of Texas fans, and I would put myself in this as a Sam Ehlinger. Like, this is my take on him. I think he's a really good college quarterback, but I think you maxed out his potential. I think there might be something more there at quarterback, but I also could see wildly inconsistent play with the young quarterback breaking in, whoever it is, Casey Thompson or Hudson Card. And you're like, man, we missed that steady ship that just gave us every time. We knew exactly what we're going to get. But maybe you get that next year and you get a little bit more of a playmaker. You get somebody, and like, again, Ehlinger was good. He wasn't great. If they stumble upon a great quarterback, that could be the difference where all of a sudden this team is deep in the season, contending in the Big 12. And maybe they don't beat Oklahoma the first time around, but they're positioning themselves for a rematch in the Big 12 championship game. The receiver position is an issue. Where, what type of talent are they going to develop? But I trust Sark as a play caller. But then I'm kind of like, well, he's got a lot on his plate now as the head coach. Like, how much time is he getting to spend drawing up, the same type of plays that he was doing at Alabama? And he doesn't have the same level of talent up front. We're all excited about Bijan Robinson. How does he utilize him? But I am more bullish on Texas. I think I fall in line with Tom. Like, I think they'll challenge Oklahoma. I don't think they'll beat them, but this would be the one in the bet of the field where I'd kind of be like, oh, maybe Texas. But again, I wouldn't be shocked if they're, I don't know if I would say around 500, but I think a 7-5 opening season, 8-4 would be clearly a letdown with the excitement that they're right now. And yet I wouldn't be totally shocked. Like if there's inconsistent play at quarterback and the secondary is getting worked over and just giving up 400 or 500 yards passing game, I wouldn't be shocked either.
Yeah.
I will say, Alfred Collins is the name to watch defensive line. Like total freak, was a Baylor commit for a long time. Texas flipped him late. He's a dude who, if it all clicks, he has like no doubt first round athleticism size combo. So that's the guy they're going to be counting on, or one of them at least, to replace some of those size production.
Yeah, and to go along with like the pass rush concerns for them going into the year, because sometimes sacks can be misleading. Like sometimes you get a lot of pressure on QBs, but you don't finish the sack, and you just look at sacks and say, "Wow, this team couldn't get any pressure." But if you just look from PFF's pass rush rate, which is just the percentage of plays the defense controls the line of scrimmage, Texas had a 52.7%, which ranks 6th in the Big 12 and was below the national average of 54. So it's not just a case where they weren't getting home. They weren't really getting pressure either, and that is something that they do need to improve.
The last thing I'll say on Texas, I thought last year that their defense did not look well coordinated, and that is probably not a reflection on the coaching as much as it is on trying to install a new scheme during COVID times, right? And then like not working together well in the Big 12, where even though the QB play was down last year in the Big 12, most teams at least attempt to chuck it around. They gave up far too many, just kind of dumb completions, stuff that was like, oh, they got 6 yards on 3rd and 5 again. And it just, that had to be frustrating as a Texas fan last year.
And, not to stray too far away from our numbers and from our hard science and evidence, but I do think that there's a intangible for Steve Sarkisian and this new staff. I mean, that was a tough year for Texas to go through all that, have the changeover on the coaching staff, have the kind of season you had. Tom Herman gets fired. Like there's a decent amount of like, hey, if you can win the locker room over, then yeah, your ceiling is going right there head to head with Oklahoma. But I think that I'm not expecting a crash and burn scenario, but I would say that it is as important as play calling, or at least drawing up a scheme for this spring, is just making that connection with the locker room, get them on your side. It's important for Sark and all of those coaches. TCU 5-4 in Big 12 play, 6-4 overall. Offensive line was a mess last season. We've got a change on that staff. Tight ends coach moves inside to be the new offensive line, and they're rebooting it. They got a guy named Brandon Coleman in from the JUCO route that showed up in my research. We are, of course, comfortable with our quarterback position, Max Duggan, being able to play football. That sure seemed like it was an exciting thing to even celebrate last season. Now let's start to see a step forward for him. I think that the offense in general wasn't very explosive. Defensively, they should be solid up front, but we might have some questions in the secondary. There hasn't been long periods of time in the Gary Patterson TCU tenure where there isn't a spike, right? Like he's pretty good at, even if it's a down on the chart, he gets back up there. He flirts with or gets double-digit wins every couple of years. It's been a minute since the last spike. So I think that it's an interesting spot for TCU where I don't see the pieces in place, but I'm looking forward to being proven wrong. Where y'all at with the Horned Frogs?
I'm going to come to the offensive line's defense here.
Okay.
Slanderous accusations.
Okay.
I don't think TCU's offensive line was that bad last year. I think they had a quarterback who held onto the ball a lot. Mm-hmm. And who kind of just danced around in the pocket before taking off, and then kind of got tackled, and it counted as sacks and all that kind of stuff. Because if you look at the metrics, like TCU's offensive line finished in line yards 55th, which isn't great. Standard downs 37th, which is pretty good. Passing downs 113th. But that's also because they had a higher sack rate. And again, if you look at the rest of their metrics, and just from watching with the eye test, it suggests to me a lot of those sacks were on the QB, not so much the line. So
hanging on to it too much, scurrying around.
So please apologize to the TCU offensive line, Chip.
Well, most of them are gone. All right. We're rebooting the damn line. Okay. One way or another, we got new contributors that are stepping in.
All right, fine. Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting year. I don't have a great read on the Horned Frogs going into the spring. I do feel like, I think it's an important year because you mentioned that they haven't had the Gary Patterson spike. And I feel like we're approaching that point where it's like, we can no longer just assume that good season is going to come. And I feel like this is going to be a very important year for Gary Patterson and TCU. Whereas if this is just another kind of mediocre 6-6, 5-7, 7-5 kind of year, that might just be what we need to expect from TCU going forward. So I don't know what to expect. I just know that that's what I'm going to be looking at this spring. I just want to see I'd like to see him improve at quarterback play, because I like Max Duggan, but I don't think that he should be your answer. I think that I'd like to see him improve. I'd like to see some guys step up at the receiver spot to create a little more, explosiveness to the offense. Really, I think the defense will probably still be pretty well coached. It'll be pretty good. I don't know if it's as talented as it has been in recent years, though, and I think that's a concern. So it's an important year, I think, for the Horned Frogs.
I'm buying.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, so look, I think Duggan is a dude who, because of his inexperience playing football, still has some unlocked potential, right? He was actually a 4-sport guy in high school. I believe he was basketball, football, track, and wrestling, I think it was. Like an Iowa kid. So he's not a dude who grew up on the 7-on-7 circuit with the private quarterback coaching and all that stuff. So I think his trajectory might be a little bit, more up than some other guys have who grew up sort of in like the quarterback factory. They've been coached with the private quarterback coach, since a young age, et cetera. That offense just needed to grow up last year. I do think the offensive line had struggles at times. They had some of their stuff was just turning guys totally loose. It wasn't necessarily always getting whipped, but they were 122nd in havoc rate allowed. And remember, only had 127 teams last year. Like Duggan had some issues. I think they had some missed checks. The receivers were largely inexperienced and not great. I just think you're going to see improvement basically all across the board there. Zach Evans came along late. Zach Evans is a guy who, if he had his stuff together, very likely could have been a 5-star for us on 24/7 Sports, and talent-wise was the number 1 back in that year's class that he ultimately signed with TCU. My real concern here, which is weird to say about a Gary Patterson defense, is the defense, right? They were okay last year, but they weren't. I don't know. I didn't think they were like really all that amazing. And I mean, top 20 was nice, but it surprises me the number of explosive plays they allowed last year, given some of the names in the back end. I mean, when you have Wallow and Morgan and Washington, and you're 126th in passing explosiveness allowed, like there's some kind of disconnect there. So maybe this year they'll play a little more conservatively on defense to counteract some of the losses they have, because those are 3 pretty big names that you lose in the back end. But that was such a hit or miss defense last year. I mean, who is 7th in passing success rate allowed and 126th in passing explosiveness allowed? Like that doesn't happen. So I think I'm buying.
I think I'm buying. I like it.
Yeah,
That's the lukewarm endorsement of TCU. I think Garrett Patterson is on the hot seat quietly. I mean, you look at the last 3 years, 7-6, 5-7, 6-4. Watch out for September 25th. Cal, interesting game from the Pac-12, September 11th. Then they play SMU. Like, if you lose to little old SMU right down the street, that's not going to bode well. I don't think they will, but that would be a disastrous loss. And that could be one of those ones where, they just kind of get a little more frustrated. And if that unfolds, then you wonder where the program is going. I think this team, clearly, it's not just this year. Where they have struggled is on the offensive side of the ball. And in this conference specifically, if you struggle on the offensive side of the ball, and a lot of it's been inconsistent quarterback play and change over a coordinator, you're going to struggle. So I think you see this sometimes with defensive minded coaches where they worry about what they do great. And it's got to be incredibly frustrating for Gary Patterson to watch the struggles of the offense when he usually puts out a typically pretty stout defense and just not be able to win the games. But I think this is going to be a real interesting year for TCU. And I'm with you guys that I don't know exactly which way it's going to go, but you've had 3 years now where there's a body of work that is not too impressive. And it's not, I think, Gary Patterson, after the 2017 season, when they went 11-3, if you said who were the top 5, top 10 coaches in college football, Gary Patterson's name is coming up in almost all of them. But it's very much, what have you done for me lately? And maybe there's a thought of, well, maybe the message just isn't resonating anymore, which I think is okay. And we've seen coaches changes made because of that before. So I think this is a huge year for Gary Patterson. I don't know if many people would be willing to say that he's on the hot seat, but I think he is.
3 top 10 finishes in a 4-year span and 5 top 10 finishes in less than a decade, from 2008 being the first one, 2017 being the last one. And you're right. We do the CBS Sports Coach rankings. Gary Patterson is a mainstay at the top. And it is going to be very interesting to see where everyone puts their ballot coming up this offseason, because nothing's better than ranking coaches. Hey, Cover 3 listeners. Opening day for the Major League Baseball season is this Thursday, April 1st. If you need any last-minute fantasy baseball prep, be sure to listen to Fantasy Baseball Today in 5 with Frank Stanfill, Scott White, and Chris Towers. It's the best way to stay up to date with the biggest news items in fantasy baseball in 5 minutes or less. Download and follow anywhere you listen to this awesome podcast. Coming up on the other side, we take a look. Neal Brown in West Virginia, Chris Kleiman in Kansas State, Matt Wells making a coordinator change at Texas Tech. Same ditto for Dave Aranda at Baylor, and we don't know what's happening at Kansas. Next. West Virginia.
Hey,
where are you? 4-4 Big 12 play, 6-4 overall. Where does Jarret Doege rank among the Big 12 quarterbacks? It's kind of wonder, I think it's a fair debate, because you could try and tell me that he's up there in the top 3 or 4, or you could tell me that, West Virginia fans might wish he had somebody else to push him. Love Letty Brown at the running back position. The wide receivers were young last year. I don't have a feel for the pecking order. Defensively, we've got some losses. Obviously, Darius Stills is the most obvious one. Just an absolute knife from the interior defensive line. He was always great at just jumping off the snap, getting into the backfield, causing all kinds of problems. But so is linebacker Tony Fields II. Now, on one hand, I feel like we found somebody who can come in and be that really high-end linebacker in a guy named Lance Dixon, a former 4-star prospect from Penn State, but he won't be there this spring. So it's not a question that we can get answered. He'll be arriving a little bit later. I thought the defense was great last season. So as we look around this West Virginia team, I think the seeds are there for this to be a step forward. Where are y'all looking for answers and information this spring?
I think the offense better take a huge step forward.
Huge step forward.
Because I think the defense is going to take a pretty sizable step backward. Just not to being bad. It's just this defense was
awesome.
They led the Big 12 in points allowed per drive last year. They were number 1 at 1.52. They were ahead of Iowa State. They were ahead of Oklahoma. And you look at everybody that they lost, both expectedly and unexpectedly in the transfer portal. There is a lot that they have to replace on that side of the ball. So it's only natural to think that it's going to be very difficult for them to maintain that kind of level. So on the offensive side of the ball, like you asked about Jarret Doege, I'd say he's middle of the pack in the Big 12. And you said that you could make an argument for top 3 or 4. I think it better be a really good argument if West Virginia is going to be, competing for anything or getting to a bowl game this year. Because I see a situation where if the defense was able, if they didn't lose so much in the defense, I thought the offense was better than the numbers suggested. And I thought we saw reasons for improvement. I think that they just really had trouble finishing in the red zone, and especially in goal to go situations last year. They settled for too many field goals. And I think that if you balance some of that out, all of a sudden that offense looks a lot better. And I think we're going to see that. It's just on the other side of the ball, I feel like they're going to be giving more points back than they take. So I think this is like a 6-6 kind of 7-5 season, but it's going to be interesting to watch that defense this spring to see if anybody pops and sticks out as somebody who's going to be a viable replacement, especially for the Stills up front. Cause those are really important pieces that you're losing from that defense. They were what made that. They did so much for that defense just with their presence. Forget the production. So that's going to be huge.
Tom, who do you take, Spencer Sanders or Jarret Doege?
Sanders. I just think that he could. Don't
you think he's a top 3 or 4 quarter? You got to remember, Texas. I'm just defending man Doege because he was a little bit conservative. But he was pretty solid. Pretty decent. His numbers statistically are better than Spencer Sanders. Like, I think if you give him the supporting cast that Brock Purdy had, he might bring more to Iowa State. Like, I think he has a tremendous amount of upside, but they got to draw it out of him. Like, from what you've seen, some of the numbers there on the pass game, he had 4 straight games of over 300-yard passing games, which is like pedestrian in the Big 12. But in that, he only had 3 completions over 40-plus yards, tied for 7th among Big 12 quarterbacks at 6.9 yards per attempt. So a little bit of a check down situation there, but some of that's with an offensive line that was struggling somewhat. But I would say that Jarret Doege's pretty like towards the upper tier of returning quarterbacks.
See, I think Sanders was better than Doege last year because, yeah, he had him on yards, but he also threw like 130 more passes than Sanders did. And I think that if you look at his touchdown interception ratio, he's like 14 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. That's great. But like you said, he was also kind of, Johnny Checkdown. He wasn't really taking shots. He was in that kind of game manager mode for them last year because their defense was so good. And I feel like with the defense taking a step back, likely you can't really afford Jarret Doege to just be, the game manager type. You're going to need him to start making some plays. And I think at least Spencer Sanders with his legs provides me another avenue. If it's not there, he can maybe take off and get something for me and at least extend drives, pick up first downs on third downs with his legs and stuff like that. I don't have as much confidence in Doege to do that. So I would take Sanders.
I think I probably agree with Sanders, but I also, some of this is teammate dependent, right? So yeah. West Virginia last year, they could not throw a lick outside the numbers. Now, part of that, maybe Doege. Part of that might be that their outside receivers weren't worth a damn, right? But their production outside the numbers was poor. Not quite as poor as their offensive line's run blocking. Now, yeah, I get it. Letty Brown had 1,000 yards, blah, 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 blah. They were 116th in rushing success rate, right? They were 122nd in rushing opportunity rate. They popped a couple long ones that really skewed what their rushing stats look like, but consistency, they were terrible running the ball. And they also couldn't push the ball down the field at all through the air. So basically, defenses just tried to sit on the short stuff. And Doege actually threw the short stuff fairly well. I mean, mainly just hit the backs and the slots over and over again. But they were okay throwing the ball. Defensively, look, man, West Virginia is not a team that recruits on a level to where you feel confident that they're going to be able to replace guys, like Sills. It's just not there. And then they've lost a ton in the defensive backfield. If you go back, listen to what Tom said. He didn't say, I think they will improve a ton on offense. What word did he say? He said, I think they better improve a whole lot on offense because he knows what's going to happen or thinks he knows what's going to happen on defense. And I agree with him. I'm not. Sometimes it can be deceptive. This could be a step back on the field year for West Virginia. Well, Coach Brown still has them going in the right direction overall, I think.
And the offensive line's inability to block and their inability to get the ball outside the hash marks kind of gives you an idea of why they struggled so much in the red zone, because once defenses were able to just kind of settle in, take away everything that they were capable of doing, they just didn't have an avenue to beat them in that kind of crowded area.
Exactly.
The Kansas State Wildcats, 4-5 in Big 12 play, 4-6 overall. Bottom fell out for these boys. Injuries, COVID issues, just ran off a losing streak to finish the season. We've got Skylar Thompson back for 2021, but not here in spring practice as he still recovers from a shoulder injury. Will Howard and 4-star freshman Jake Rubley or Rubley? Rubley, maybe?
Sure.
Going with Rubley. Jake Rubley. Defense needs to reload. We got 4 transfers coming in on that side of the ball, including a couple of Power 5 transfers. And this isn't great if you want to be overwhelming opponents with your wide receiver talent. Kansas State's top 2 receivers last year were tight end Briley Moore and running back Deuce Vaughn. So, maybe not sustainable. So what's on the top of mind for Kansas State?
I don't know. I think the way that Kansas State plays offense, we could see a lot of seasons in which their leading receivers are tight ends and running backs.
They can probably win.
How they're built to play.
Yeah, they can win 9 games with your leading receivers being running backs and tight ends, especially if your running back's Deuce Vaughn.
Yeah, it's hard to know, like you said, with everything that they dealt with last year, it's hard to figure out what we could take away and what we should probably just ignore. I like Chris Kleiman as a coach. So because of that, I always am a little more optimistic, I think, about what Kansas State can be and where they could be. And I think if Skylar Thompson comes back and he's healthy, I think that will help them. I think Deuce Vaughn is very fun to watch. I think he's one of the more exciting playmakers in the conference. So I think that helps them. Defensively, wasn't very great last year. I think we're going to need to see a better performance there. The kind of, when you think of Kansas State, you kind of always think of defense and special teams. So I have some confidence that we should see something of a bounce back there, but again, you can't assume it. So I think that's going to be an area I'm watching this spring. And I'd also like with Thompson out for the spring and Will Howard getting a lot more snaps and Rubley or whatever his name is, or pronounced. I think it's good for them this spring that they're going to get a lot of reps, because Will Howard came in last year for Skylar and he looked like a QB that needs a lot of reps. So I think that's good news for the Wildcats as far as building depth behind him going forward. So that's really what I'm looking at this spring from them.
So if you recall back to the ACC episode, we talked about how crazy Miami's split between explosiveness and efficiency was. Kansas State's got him beat. Kansas State was 115th in offensive efficiency and 6th in explosiveness, which basically means if they didn't hit like a 30 or 40-yard play on that drive, they weren't scoring.
The Deuce Vaughn effect.
Basically, yeah. I think Chris Kleiman is a very good coach. They sort of have a Northwestern feel to me, where it's like, yeah, the numbers say Northwestern should be like 5-7, and yet there's no way in hell I'm betting on Northwestern to miss a bowl game just because I've seen some of this, the close game magic that Coach Fitz pulls. I think Kleiman is sort of the same way based on how they play. My existing concerns echo Tom's about the offense. So I have some questions there. Defensively, I have some new questions, and they lose Drew Wiley and they lose Wyatt Huber, and those are big time losses. Kansas State doesn't send a whole lot of defensive linemen to the NFL, and both these guys look like they could be NFL draft picks in 21. So replacing those dudes to me is a big time deal, because the rest of that defense isn't nearly as good, talent wise, if it doesn't have those difference makers up front.
I think this team's going to be. I think that Northwestern comp is pretty good. Like you can maximize. There'll be some times when you get a senior veteran class, you can maybe challenge for the upper tier, but you're probably not going to be as good as Ohio State. Kind of at Kansas State, you can be really good, but you're not going to be as good as Oklahoma or even Texas. Clearly, you guys, I'm sure Skylar Thompson was a super senior, right? One of the most impactful ones mentioned on there. Clearly, when they lost him, he's, had such an impact on the season. But I don't know. I think the game against Stanford's going to be really interesting, because it opens up the season. Stanford, is kind of in this spot where we don't know exactly where to get from them. Like that could either propel the Big 12 or the Pac-12. It kind of has a lot of weight from that one, but it probably is a game that'll be off the radar a little bit. And I think, since we're talking about Northwestern, Stanford's another similar school where you got to kind of maximize your talent while they're there. But I think the offense returns all 5 starters. They've got some good pieces returning offensively. It's probably a middle of the pack Big 12 team.
Do you think that they are just like they lost to Arkansas State, then beat Oklahoma? Like I kind of felt like that was a great representation of Kansas State football, right? Like there's no way that you could expect the same thing for an entire season.
Yeah.
No chance. Yeah. Texas Tech 3-6 in Big 12 play, 4-6 overall. This is the landing spot for Tyler Shough, the former Oregon quarterback who arrives, and we got some raves, baby. We got coaches raving about how this guy just has to be run out of the facility. He's working too hard, boys. He's too committed to getting better. New offensive coordinator Sonny Cumbie says he just can't say enough about him. You got to run him out of the facility. So hey, they're excited. You got your job as Texas Tech quarterback Tyler Shough is to score 38 points a game, because it does not seem to matter what kind of scheme we're running, what the players look like. Texas Tech defense is going to be giving up at least 35 points a game. So good luck, Tyler. At the wide receiver position, you lose TJ Vasher and a few more other key contributors, but Eric, Izukama, right? Eric Izukama, I think, is going to be your wide receiver number one. Again, defensively, it's still Keith Patterson as the defensive coordinator. They weren't great last year. Not expecting them to be great this year. So the big headline is your new offensive coordinator and your new quarterback. Let's see if they can go put together one of the more high-end Texas Tech offenses, which at its ceiling historically can still be pretty darn good.
Danny, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about TCU about how the problems you felt like for TCU in recent years were offensively. Like offensively, they've struggled in recent years. And it's like, now we need to see them take that kind of step forward if TCU is going to take a step forward. Chip, you mentioned that Sonny Cumbie is Texas Tech's new offensive coordinator. Where did Sonny Cumbie spend the last 5 seasons as an offensive coordinator?
TCU.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to watch that this spring, but I do think that Texas Tech's offense last year was decent. You mentioned the defense as well. And that was a problem right from the start when against Houston Baptist, they were allowing 8 yards per play in the season opener. And you thought
all of the Baptists in Houston were allowed to score touchdowns against Texas Tech.
And that week you're telling yourself, well, COVID season, it's the first week, no real buildup. We shouldn't read too far into that. And it's true. They did not give up 8 yards per play again that season, but they didn't do much better against anybody. They had a few games where they were solid against Kansas and other bottom tier. I think Baylor, they played well. But other than that, it was we got a new coach who's bringing in a new style, but it was the same story with Texas Tech where defensively, it didn't really matter what they did on offense because they were just going to give the points right back. So for me this spring, there's going to be plenty of attention on Sonny Cumbie and that offense and Shough coming in. Man, that team needs to take a step forward on the defensive side of the ball. And I have reasons to think it could happen because when they made the Matt Wells hire, I thought it was a good hire. And to this point, I don't think I've seen the kind of impact that I thought he was going to have on this program. So I think this is a pretty big year for Matt Wells and this team and this program. So if it's going to happen, it's going to happen on the defensive side of the ball. So if I'm a Red Raiders fan right now, that's what all my focus is this spring.
Guess who was Texas Tech was actually number 1 in the country in something. You guys know what it is?
Turnovers?
Passes behind the line of scrimmage.
Hell yes.
35% of their passes were behind the line of scrimmage. Not coincidentally, they really didn't throw the ball at all to the slots or the tight ends. It was mostly just slip screens and swings to the backs.
And that was mostly with Alan Bowman got hurt for a little bit, right? With Michigan.
Henry Colombi came in. Yeah. Yeah. So that is something I would definitely expect to see improved with the new QB play, getting the ball down the field, actually working the ball between the hashes. Some might actually occur this year. That'd be solid. But really, if this team's going to improve, it has to get better on the defensive line. 115th last year in defensive line havoc. I mean, that's too many times opposing quarterbacks are operating with a clean pocket. And in the Big 12, that's just going to get you killed. So, and it did repeatedly, like Tom mentioned. So D-line improvement is my real question here. I think they'll be better at the QB position.
I think this team, obviously, I think it's a huge year for Matt Wells, although I didn't exactly inherit. I mean, it's kind of what Texas Tech has been. How hard is it to change the identity of great offense and subpar defense? But that's exactly what they've been for the past 10 to 15 years. Even Cliff Kingsbury, who somehow parlayed his 5-7, 6-7, 5-7 finish into a job with the Arizona Cardinals is still sort of beyond me because he's friends with Sean McVay, but that's a whole nother story. But if you look deeper in the results, I mean, how about the roller coaster ride of almost getting beat by Houston Baptist, then taking Texas to overtime in weeks 1 and 2 for Texas Tech, and you look deeper, they were pretty competitive in a lot of their games. So I have hope for them. I think Matt Wells, I covered him a couple times when he was at Utah State. I really liked him. I liked his energy. I thought he had a plan. I think, I kind of feel like he's a good hire for Texas Tech, but at some point you got to start converting and winning some of those games. And I don't know, the Tyler Shough thing was interesting because I was a little bit surprised when he left Oregon. I think he's a pretty good quarterback, so I think they'll get an upgrade at quarterback. So I think you'll see I think not a breakout season, but I think you'll see a better, more stable season with more wins as a result for Texas Tech.
Tyler Shough says that Tyler Shough got 20 to 30 calls when he put his name in the transfer portal.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
I believe that.
You guys, are you mocking him, Chip? Or are you saying, because I think he would be one that a lot of schools would call on.
20 to 30 seemed high, but I obviously didn't. That only is on, it did not make the notepad. It's just still on my mind.
It just resonated with
Hating Chip.
A lot of these schools don't even need somebody, like it's their job in the office to do their due diligence. So they go ahead and call just to figure out, okay, like, why is a kid leaving? Do they find out something about that program that, maybe like they're interested in why he's leaving Oregon? They want the dirt. Like these schools call.
20 to 30. Multiple dozens. Tyler Shough hater. Baylor was 2-7 last season. They opted not to participate in the postseason. Larry Fedora out as offensive coordinator after one glorious season where they couldn't run the ball and the offense was bad. Charlie Brewer is gone as well. He's off to Arizona, right?
Yes.
I think
no, so.
Utah. Charlie Brewer's at Utah. Jacob Zeno or Jerry Bohannon, that's going to be your quarterback competition to watch. Jeff Grimes is the new offensive coordinator. He comes from BYU. So Jeff Grimes also, I believe, has offensive line coach background as well. Does that sound right? And so I think you got to be able to fix things up front. You got to be able to find a way to run the ball. And as offensive coordinator, you're going to be tasked with trying to figure out how to put it all together. Yes, offensive line coach at Auburn and Virginia Tech. I knew I had that from somewhere. So, when I saw the move, I thought, all right, Jeff Grimes, you just had Zach Wilson. Like, now it's time to cash in, right? Like, you're not going to be hotter as an offensive coordinator than you are. So you've got this opportunity. You're going to go to Baylor. Very interesting to see how things come together for the Bears offense. Dave Aranda, I guess we trust for the Bears defense, but that's not as many questions, especially with all the turnover that we have on offense. So as Dave Aranda prepares for year 2, where's the expectations and the curiosity?
I am super pumped about Jeff Grimes.
Okay.
Ooh, okay.
That Baylor offense was really fun to watch. And it was really interesting to watch. It was so good that Zach Wilson is now considered a better quarterback than Justin Fields. BYU. Like that, I feel like Zach Wilson is a very good quarterback who Jeff Grimes made look a lot better, because I think that offense was well designed and well schemed, and he did a very good job of getting receivers open.
He got Romney's wide open, multiples.
Exactly. So I think that, Baylor really needs an infusion of offense, because that offense was awful last year. Like and to go from where they had been like the year before with Matt Rule to Dave Aranda, and it's like, obviously we kind of expected it with Aranda being his defensive coordinator background. You always see that kind of happen, but I think this is a very good move. And I think if I'm a Baylor fan, it's a move that excites me, because I think that alone will improve it. I don't think they're going to jump out to have the same kind of season BYU did, but this spring, that's what I'm watching if I'm a Baylor fan, because it's a very entertaining offense to watch. And like, just from whether you're watching like the all 22 crushing film or you're just watching it as a fan, there's a lot of little interesting wrinkles in there that you might enjoy.
I'm interested to see how much Dave Aranda lets him operate. Dave Aranda is kind of on my no bet list as a head coach already. I thought his game management was really poor last year. He managed a game like somebody was he was going to go for it on fourth down, a lot of really, really short gains. And then they'd get to 4th and 3 on the opponent's 38 and punt. Yeah. I mean, Dave Aranda kneecapped his team a lot of times, and that sucks for their offense. They had to play under him like that. We'll see if he adjusts as a head coach, but the game management decisions were bad. Just some of the worst you would see on a weekly basis. I know, Tom, if you were live betting that stuff, you were like, oh my God, the algorithm's not going to account for this.
They were under gods last year.
Right. And it wasn't inefficiency, although it was, but some of that stuff was really bad decision making. So I'm very interested to see that. We won't know in spring if he improves upon that. They were just so bad on offense last year in basically every area except for short passes. So I really wonder, what do they lose in Brewer? Was Brewer, Utah taking Brewer makes me wonder, if he was actually good, or maybe they're just taking a shot, because he was okay in 2019. man, I don't know. Like
to drive home your point a little bit, Baylor punted on 47% of its drives last year. The only team in the Big 12 that punted more often was Kansas at 54.3%, and the national average was 38.4%. So Baylor punted about 10% more often than the national average team.
Yeah.
So Baylor was 100th in scoring offense last year, 23.3 points a game. When Grimes took over BYU in 2018, he was coming off a season with BYU, was 124th in scoring offense. Then he went from 79th to 67th to last year. They finished at number 3 with 43.5 points a game. Now, I hear what you're saying, Tom, about excited about Jeff Grimes, but there's a part of me that says, oh, Zach Wilson's going to be a top 3, top 5 pick in the draft this year. I don't know if Jacob Zeno or Jerry Bohannon are going to be those type of guys.
I hear that, but I don't think Zach Wilson's a top 3 or 5 quarterback in the draft this year without Grimes.
Right. And it goes hand in hand. I do think so. But he's clearly an incredibly talented quarterback. Mm-hmm. But I think you'll see improvement. But I'm with you. I would say, hey, if it wasn't working, which it wasn't, make a change, rip the Band-Aid off, go in a new direction. So I credit Dave Aranda for that. And I was wrong on Baylor last year. I thought they could be a 500 team, maybe even, I think I took the over on the win total for them last year and was disastrously wrong. No spring practice last year. They get that back. And it's kind of like all the first-year coaches we talked about. Now you have the advantage of a full spring. Hopefully you're Reiner at the quarterback position. And you kind of feel like Aranda is a defensive-minded guy, which clearly is where some of this punting comes from, of, hey, trust your defense. The defense has to get better too. I mean, like, I just think this will be an improved team. It's just a matter of how much improvement do you see.
And the Kansas Jayhawks, 0-8 last year, 0-9, 0-8 in Big 12 play, 0-9 overall, and I've got no clue. I don't know. There is
about their coach or about their season or
about anything.
I got a meeting. I got to bounce. I'll see you guys. But my Kansas thing is blank because they haven't even hired a head coach. So I'll see you guys later.
Yeah, I don't know. So do you have any expectations? What can we learn? I
think it'll be the worst team in college football.
Yeah, I mean, I hate saying it because it just seems so mean and cheap and easy, but it's just given Kansas's history and then looking at everything that's happening there this off season, how could you have any kind of optimism about what's going to happen in 2021?
Yeah, I don't know. I've got no clue. We've been running this podcast for longer than our normal podcast. We're not just trying to get out of here. Like, we really don't know. I don't know anything. I don't know.
Their win total is going to be a half game, right? Or no, they have, but even if that's,
what's their schedule?
It's probably gonna be a half game, maybe 1.5, but I would probably take the under.
You want to break down their schedule right now? That'll be our Kansas segment. Let's see. They open with South Dakota. Can't assume that's a win. Second game is at Coastal.
They've lost. They're 0-2 against them.
Yeah. Baylor, probably not. At Duke, at Iowa State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, at Oak State, Kansas State, Texas, at TCU, West Virginia. It's like they have to win that South Dakota game
to be able. Yeah. They're going to set it at 1 with awful juice. That's what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Just leave open the push.
Because they won't want you betting on it either.
He is Tom Fernell. You can follow him on Twitter at Tom Fernell. You can follow him at Danny Cannell. You can follow him off somewhere at Bud Elliott 3. You can follow me at Chip_Patterson. Gentlemen, thank you very much.